A game that seems to divide opinion is the Order 1886. Some love it, some despise it. With it having been 10 years now since the release of the controversial title, I thought it's as good time as any to look back on it. But before we get into it, make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. Without further ado, let's go. The Order 1886 was developed by Ready at Dawn and published by Sony Computer Entertainment as an exclusive for the PlayStation 4. Before we can understand the mixed opinions on the Order 1886, however, we must first comprehend the state of Sony's PlayStation at the time. This was prior to the release of some big hitters for the PlayStation 4, and Killzone Shadowfall, Knack, and Infamous Second Son were among the biggest exclusives on the system. So patience was wearing thin. The story had some great potential but ultimately failed to deliver. Set in an alternate history version of the year 1886, where the Jack the Ripper murders for some odd reason took place 2 years prior to when they actually happened in real life, and where London is populated by half-breed monsters, an order of knights is tasked with a job to keep the world safe from these creatures. The Order had discovered a magical liquid substance known as Blackwater that significantly extended their life expectancies and provided them with some healing abilities that aided them in their fight against the half-breeds. One of these Knights of the Round Table, Sir Galahad, is our protagonist. His mentor, Sir Percival, one of the Order's most OG knights, is suspicious of the correlation between rebel attacks against the United India Company, a trading company that had seized control over the East Indies, and the Lycan half-breed attacks that had become increasingly present in London. However, the Lord Chancellor definitively dismissed his concerns and insisted that he should remain solely focused on fighting off the half-breeds. Regardless, Percival and Galahad take two other members of the Order, Lady Igraine and Marquis de Lafayette, with them in a mission to Whitechapel, a rebel stronghold. This leads on to them gaining intel that the rebels are plotting on assassinating the company chairman, Lord Hastings. Therefore, they board an airship in order to put a stop at this attempt on his life, but in doing so, a bomb is detonated, leading to the untimely death of Sir Percival. Following his death, the Council of Knights have a meeting interrupted by an attack on Westminster, again with the attempted murder of Lord Hastings being foiled. Sir Galahad mows down countless enemies, exerting his frustration after his mentor's death, before his eye catches an Indian rebel that was on board the airship. Against the Order's wishes, Galahad chases after her, which leads him onto a wild conspiracy. Turns out the rebel leader is the presumed dead Queen Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi, who leads Sir Galahad to the United India Company warehouses in Blackwall in an attempt to prove to him that they are the real enemy, which she does. There are crates upon crates of dormant, hibernating vampires set to be imported into the US. Lakshmi claims that Lord Hastings himself is a vampire and is responsible for the Jack the Ripper killings. As he was with Sir Percival, the Lord Chancellor refused to see reason regarding the matter. Luckily, his son Lucan decides to hear him out. So, the two of them infiltrate the United India Company HQ in Mayfair with Lakshmi, where they spot Hastings in his vampiric form. However, before Galahad can do something about the matter, Lucan reveals that he's a Lycan and viciously attacks him. Following a grueling battle between the two, Lucan flees as Galahad is captured and accused of treason and sentenced to death, as was customary for criminals at the time. Obviously, Sir Galahad wasn't about to let this happen, was he? But in trying to escape, he leaps into the River Thames and gets seriously injured. Luckily for him, Nikola Tesla, the Order's armourer, saves his life and gets Lakshmi to help nurse him back to fitness. But before he fully recovers, Nikola heads back to the Order to stop arousing suspicion. But Galahad isn't convinced and is worried for his safety, so he heads to Westminster after him. He locates him and gets him to safety, with Lucan also in the vicinity. The two of them get into a second confrontation, but this time, Galahad comes out on top. Fatally wounded, Lucan explains his reasoning for betraying the Order. He only wanted to save his race from becoming extinct, but expresses his remorse for doing so in the way he did. The duo's conversation is interrupted by Lucan's father, the Lord Chancellor, who explains that he was aware of Lucan's condition. Turns out the Lord Chancellor murdered Lucan's family of Lycans but couldn't bring himself to murder an innocent boy, so he took him in and looked after him as if he was his own. The Lord Chancellor orders that Lucan's betrayal must be kept under wraps and can't be used to clear Galahad's name for the sake of the Order. After forgiving one another, Galahad delivers the final blow and kills Lucan, seemingly ready to do as the Lord Chancellor commands and disappearing from the city while his possible love interest Lady Igraine views him as a traitor. The entire campaign, spanning 16 chapters, only lasts around 7 hours, which is a disappointment in and of itself, but the gameplay is where it utterly falls apart for many people. It plays as a cover-based third-person shooter action-adventure, and as a title that was inspired by Naughty Dog's Hollywood blockbuster-like storytelling and set pieces in Uncharted 2, it seemed like this AAA PlayStation exclusive was destined for success. So what went wrong? The beauty of video games as an art form is the interactivity the player has with the medium. If there's a lack of it, the developers aren't making full use of the industry's capabilities, and with the Order 1886, it seems that they were chasing movies with their high production value and insanely gorgeous graphical fidelity and not focusing on the gameplay, and it showed. I mean, that's not always a problem, but when you market yourself as a third-person shooter, it can be. The sheer amount of quick time events and button prompts made it feel more like an Until Dawn-like decision-based interactive movie title than a third-person shooter, which gave off the vibe that the game was quite confused with its own identity. It didn't know what it wanted to be. The game felt quite cinematic heavy, and even when you were given the reins to move around at your own leisure, it was quite linear in the sense that it feels very much like you're pushing the analog stick to move the character forward along a corridor for a large chunk of this experience. Which works in its detriment because the times when you're in fact given the opportunity to get in a shootout with enemies, the gunplay is certainly fun. Despite the Victorian England setting and time period, some of the equipment at Galahad's disposal was seriously ahead of its time. Alongside smoke grenades, hand grenades, assault rifles, shotguns, snipers, crossbows, explosive barrels, a variety of handguns and weapons that ignite thermite, you have this energy-producing blaster that you have to charge before unleashing at your enemies. Speaking of which, when it comes to the enemies you're facing, although initially fun, the fights with the Lycans become repetitive and thus stale as a result, with the button prompts to dodge before shooting and stabbing them to death to slaughter them. However, if you are overwhelmed, you can hide behind cover. Some of the walls you can hide behind are destructible, which add to the tension during a gunfight. But if in a desperate situation, Galahad can enter Black Sight, where he can pick off enemies in slow motion like Deadeye from the Red Dead Redemption series, or Bullet Time from Max Payne. And it's always great to do so with the breathtakingly gorgeous London as a backdrop. As a born and bred Londoner, I really appreciate the level of effort that clearly went into that. Right, enough praise. Let's get on to some of the more negative aspects of the gameplay. The climbing segments are half-baked and unnecessary, especially considering how slow, sluggish and underdeveloped the mechanics are. The minigames in the form of rotating the right analog stick to find the correct angle to pick a lock and hitting the L3 and R3 buttons at the right time to hack electricity boxes feel way too archaic to not become a nuisance. Not to mention that it feels like there was clearly some sort of cut content, as there's a segment whereby you use the touchpad to speak in Morse code when requesting air support. Once. I repeat, once. Either that, or they felt obliged to shoehorn the mechanic in to utilize the PlayStation 4's gimmicks, given that they themselves are making a Sony exclusive game. All in all, the abrupt cliffhanger ending seemed to suggest that they wanted and intended on making a sequel. Unless, well, they just don't know how to end a story. But ultimately, the title was very flashy with its high production costs, but lacked any real substance within its underdeveloped gameplay to sell enough to warrant a sequel so soon after the original's release. With the intellectual property being owned by Sony and Ready at Dawn having been bought by Meta and put under the Oculus Studio to focus solely on VR titles for their system until, unfortunately, eventually closing down the studio on 7th of August 2024, it seems unlikely that we'll get a sequel. At least not the one initially intended from the original developers. If we were to get a sequel, which is still very well possible given that PlayStation recently renewed the trademark for it, it would be made by different developers entirely. And if we don't, it would be a real shame given the huge potential both lore and gameplay wise. Not to mention the massive cliffhanger fans were left on. Thanks so much for watching. Drop a like if you enjoyed the video, comment your thoughts on the Order 1886 and subscribe for more retrospectives and video essays from me. See ya!